participants and I have decided that we would like this to be more of a roundtable conversation. So the plan is that I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll sort of open up with some questions, give the participants a chance to answer them, and then we will put them out to the audience so that we can have more of a collaborative discussion. Would you like to start with intros?
Hi, my name is Gabriel of Los Angeles. I'm a fourth-year Learning Science and Human Development doctorate student over at the University of Washington. I am also the son of Chief Andy de Los Angeles inside of the Snoqualmie tribe, over in the rural state of Washington. I'm also of Filipino heritage as well, and so the intersectionality of those cultural spaces is my life's work and play.
Hi, I'm Nuncio. I've been LARPing for about 10 years now, on and off. As of recently, as a half Hispanic woman, I actually have been getting a lot more into gaming as other studies, and been studying a lot more into the subject itself. So, and through theory, I do want to continue my studies as into the sociological and psychological aspects of our culture and gaming itself.
Hi, I'm Lynne. I am one half of the game review site and YouTube channel Game and Curry. I also write LARPs with a little bit of intersectionality, and I'm excited to hear what all of you are going to talk about.
Hey, I'm Jay, and I'm freezing. So you may not be able to tell under all this clothing, but I'm Chinese.
Cool. I'm Chinese too.
I'm 1.5 generation. So I came over here when I was really young. I grew up here, but I was born in China. Let's see, I've been LARPing for about 20 years. And yeah, I'm also really curious what everyone has to say.
All right, I'll do a quick introduction of myself since I realized I told you my name, but that was about it. So my sort of academic identity is Katherine Castiello Jones, and I am a sociologist by training, but also do some game scholarship. But I also design games and organize games under the name Cat Jones. And my mother immigrated from Cuba to Iowa in 1962. So that is one of my entrees into the gaming as other realm. So this is the gaming as other roundtable. And so the first question that I want everyone to address is what we mean by the term other. In some of the other panels and mentioned by some of our keynote speakers, language is very important. And when I say other, I cannot be assured that I mean the same thing as anyone else in the room when I use that term. So I think a starting point for us is just when we use the term other, what are we trying to get at, and what do we mean?
So, wasn't it, I want to say it was maybe Beltran who invented or popularized the term gaming as other. For me, I have a huge problem with the term as it exists overall, because gaming as other means that at first I looked at it and couldn't parse it out. Was that am I playing other? But when I started reading into the literature, the depiction was I am other, and if I am other, who is not other? And so when we want to talk about inclusion and exclusion in its very notion of design, does this become more of a space of like specific groups and instances, or are we talking about a systemic definition that will move people from normative to not normative? And so that's where I'm thinking about it, and not comfortable with the term gaming as other.
For gaming as other for myself, it's what I've seen throughout various game systems and through at least LARPing and tabletoping and video games and comic books and tabletop games is that it tends to be gaming itself is always systematically placed to a certain people of sorts, usually white boys and teenagers or young adults. And as of lately, it has been expanding a lot more, yes, but there are still systematically exclusiveness in like comic books and LARPing in general. And you know, as gaming as other, I want to be one of the few who actually can add more inclusivity to the system, because you know, LARPing is a community for me, and I want to see it grow as a community to like be inclusive for everybody. And hopefully, as it goes on, others don't really have to exist anymore. We all could be just gamers at that point, you know, like so.
Yeah, going off on what both of you said so far, I think it is pretty interesting that we are considering I mean, not that we're considering ourselves as other, but like we're that term exists to sort of differentiate ourselves from like what we normally see as like the cis white dudes that play games, and how like are we owning otherness, or is that like what's going on? So I think it does open up a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think I kind of understand more about it. Like, I never really thought about myself as other. I had to have other people tell me that, hey, by the way, you're not standard. I'm like, really? So like, I remember like a number of years ago when fantasy movies of all our favorite books like started coming out, and my first reactions to going to many of those movies were like, man, they totally like cast the characters wrong. Like, that's not what those characters look like at all. Everybody's too bony. And then like years later, after like this happened many times, I was like, no, you know what? It's because like everybody has bone structures of white people, but I'd always just projected myself, like, you know, and kind of more rounded features into all of these characters, and that's why I think all the movies are cast wrong. But like, it took many, many years after that for me to be like, no, I'm not the one who's like, they're not the ones who did it wrong, you know, like. So yeah, I mean, I don't really care for like gaming as pumpkins or whatever we're getting at.
Can you rename the panel gaming something?
Oh my god, I totally did that.
All right, so folks in the audience, do other people have ways that they relate to this term, opinions about why this term is useful, maybe why the term is problematic, that they would like to share?
I feel like the term other has a lot of, it is not in the definition. Other is not white. Other is not cis. Other is not male. But there's no actual definition of what other is, which is where the problem comes in, from my perspective at least.
I think we should distinguish two cases, others during the law and others in the community. If we are speaking about others during the law, it's when it depends on a particular law. If we are playing, I don't know, the times of Conquista in Spain, others may be people of Arabic origin. And if we are playing Crusaders, others are Muslims and Jews, and so on. If we are playing Celts, others may be Romans. And this is what is to be described by game masters who are creating the game world in particular. And the other question is the question of what the community thinks about who are the others for this particular community, because I'm sure that there are this for the American LARP community and there are this for the Russian LARP community or for Scandinavians. These are totally different others. And that is, I think, we should distinguish this and decide what we are going to talk about, because we won't have time for both, and we won't get too deep enough if we are trying to discuss these two big questions at the moment.
Yeah, I really like other being anything that's not the default, so other being anything that's not male or non-white. And I wonder if it would be more helpful if it was in quotes, like naming as other. That way, it's, you're not othering yourself, but it's what other people consider other.
This year at Origins Games on Demand, we have a diversity scholarship that we introduced and raised over $1,100 for. Of course, the question is, then what did count as diversity? And our internal debates were very interesting on that point. And so, in addition with Anna's problematization of, sort of in-game and out-of-game, there's also the visible diversity or visible otherness and invisible diversity. Neuroatypicality is not quote unquote visible. Race is a very problematic category when you're staring at people, when certain people quote unquote pass or not. We then, in terms of how to divide up the funding, we had to decide, how do we rank specific forms of otherness? So we can say, oh, it's a nebulous term, but there's real money and real consequences around what is defined as other and who falls into this category or not.
I think to talk about other is also you always talk about it in relation to the norm. So maybe we should think less about othering and more about norm hacking, right? How do you expand the norm to include greater plurality of people?
So I'm just going to jump in quickly because I have lots of feelings about this. The reason that I like the term other is because to me it speaks to having the experience of feeling other or feeling marginalized in a particular space. And I like that it is fluid. It doesn't presuppose why I am being marginalized in a particular space. And that it can encompass multiple aspects of identity, right? That it might not just be one aspect of my identity that is leading me to be marginalized in this particular situation, but that there are intersections of my identity that could lead to me being othered. Yes?
That's what I was thinking, something very similar to what Sarah Med talks about when she talks about others, that other is transitory. So it's not about all others can be lumped together. That Patricia Hill Collins' experience as a black woman means nothing to Sarah Med because she's never lived it. But
Right.
Sarah Med's position as a woman of color, of a different color, it's a different other. And so that's why in her newest work she's talking about others. So people get locked into this idea of all others share the same experience, and they don't. That you have to recognize that even when you're othering yourself, there are other others that you still may not, and I know that's confusing, but sometimes the reading actually get it. But the fact that there may be other experiences within it. Other is not meant to be the definer like race or sexual orientation that we try to put into these boxes. It's just meant to be that there is this stereotypical experience that people assume on the social institution. We are everything outside of that.
The problem with the notion of the transitive properties of otherness, though in the powered relationship of hierarchy of us versus normative, is that the normative will take that situational placement of otherness and call it reverse racism, reverse whatever ism, and put it into a space where they think that the powered relationship, because they're losing some form of privilege in their space, that they can call it out as a form of hatred against themselves. So I understand and appreciate both the notion of transition of otherness to being fluid in that space, but at the same time, if we don't find a more static or at least a real transparency and porousness in the idea of otherness, then to call out otherness in response to defending ourselves against oppression becomes a problem when we get re-oppressed in reverse.
So I'm wondering, do we need to precisely define other in order to discuss what it is like to game as the other, or even what it means to game as the other? And I don't quite understand from what I'm hearing so far, is how this discussion about what other is brings back to this idea of what type of games are we talking about othering in? Are we talking about in living games, in one style of LARP versus another, in computer games where there's some very definite issues? But I'm not seeing how these are fitting together.
All right, so that's a good segue into our next set of questions, which is about experiences that we have had surviving and operating in gaming spaces where we have been othered, where we have felt othered. And particularly, one of the questions that was asked was, how has this affected the evolution and practice of your creativity? And this can
there's a lot to happen for these things to, unfold. But also on top of that, we need to look at the game design itself and look at it critically and be like, why are these systematic places in place? Yes, I know it's full of darkness, the name of itself. But at the same time, you're really just like, really? So yeah, that's just one thing that that's been about 10 years ago. So it's just still something that really.
Can you refresh on that question?
Yeah, so how has having to survive or operate in gaming spaces where you feel othered affected your creativity in terms of evolution and practice?
How does it affect my creativity? Well, I guess it doesn't, well, to a certain degree, it does affect my creativity because my indigeneity inherently becomes a part of everything and anything that I do, whether or not I'm in character or out of character. The philosophies, that I wish to play with and I wish to engage in will be a part of backstories and choices that I make no matter what. That's bleed. That's real deep work right there. But at the same time, externally, there is that whole call upon, and I guess that being as an Indigenous person, knowing that I'm also an Indigenous PhD, which is like 1% of the 1% of the 1% of 1% that sits in that level of existence. I understand the reason and desire for others to use me as a form of tokenism, to answer questions, to create a sense of understanding. And I also get tired of it. But that doesn't stop me from having to do the work as an educator. But that's a personal choice that I'm making. And what that does for me in terms of creativity and the work that I want to do is it makes me push those boundaries on expectations of what we call settler colonialism in the field, and decolonization, which we, as practicing Indigenous scholars and players, try to undo on a regular, everyday basis with interactions.
So I think for me, I've had this kind of dichotomy between being interested in Chinese and Asian narratives and artifacts and fiction, and also really for most of my gaming career not wanting to come across as unversatile or as this person always plays themselves, right? So I used to I'd go into gaming group and then I would find one of the alpha guys, right? And then I would go pick a fun fight with the alpha guy, no harm kind of, and then I would make sure I would play a character who was very unappealing, unfeminine, very non-Asian as much as I could. And even in groups that I was familiar with, I think it was only in the past few years that I've started playing Asian characters at all. And it's been this interesting thing for me because I don't know, I realize that I have to be the one to bring in some of the themes or some of the stories that I'm interested in, even though even though it feels weird to both bring in the stories and have to represent and have to defend myself and be but I'm not pigeonholing myself, So I guess that's been a journey of nerve for me, kind of.
Do I need a microphone? Can everybody hear me? So, you can confirm, these are the texts that just came up on my phone just now. I haven't opened my phone, these are just now.
Oh, shit.
If you could give it an ethnic sensitivity class, I'd appreciate it. I just finished the Lucha Libre school for our LARP, and I want you to give me some ideas. So my friend messages me to ask me for feedback on, this is a white guy, on a school that he's written because he's a huge fan of Lucha Libre style. But I'm the person he chooses to go to give an ethnic sensitivity class. However, I'm not speak to that generalized other concept that I should have, although I do research on interrelations, so there is that angle of it, of course. But it's always what you were speaking to about feeling like, yeah, this is my work, so I should offer this expertise and this body of knowledge, but also I'm not an expert in this particular identity, and also why I was me, and I'm tired of it. And so I just want to say that resonated for me, and this is definitely not the first time that's come up. And also just getting flagged constantly on Facebook and what about LARP and identity, LARP and role, LARP and race, and then just I'm off doing work and suddenly, oh, I got called to a thread. It's about this again.
To speak to that a little bit, I'm here labeling myself as an Indigenous scholar and Indigenous LARPer for convenience. There are 565 American Indian sovereign nations within the lower 48 and states, and whatnot, and not to discount Hawaii or Alaska and the like. So I don't, the notion of other also becomes an inclusion and exclusion. I am also indigenously included in and indigenously excluded from a great deal of spaces for a great many reasons.
So I've been part of the CareCon community and have been building LARP communities since I started LARPing. How do we go about? What do we do? What can you tell us? What can we do better to be more inclusive, to build this community wider and bigger, and bring in all those stories? Because that's what we want.
Can I speak really quick? I think the problem is that, like, the person who sends me that text is trying to do that, right? This person is trying to be inclusive. The person who says, I want to change my name because I want to add diversity, I cannot speak to their motivation, but one might be a positive one, right? So at the same time that people reach out and are trying to make strides, they're also making us more marginalized than other.
Also, too, when you look at people who want to take other ethnicities and cultures into their own game, you gotta look into it by what they want, by what they're trying, their intentions are, versus what the impressions they are giving off. So what they're intending to do might be something that's more inclusiveness, but at the same time, the impression that they're giving is being they're exploiting that culture or that community.
I want to respond to that question specifically, because I feel like all five of us had a real strong set of reactions to that question, because it is a very typical question that becomes engaged in this space as people of color and in this gaming field, and at the very same time. The execution of diversity within games and game communities is one that gets seated in diversity as a trend, object, or goal. And how do you actually create a semblance of inclusivity and not exclusivity by not using diversity as a form of object or trait, rather than a practice of an set of inclusion moves. So I was just at in a class where they were talking, where a speaker, female software engineer was in talking about their exclusion from the software industry as a computer science major, even though they're fucking brilliant workers and they do amazing work, and they're looking for that right company to work in, and they're reaching out into other communities where other female software engineers have created their groups and banded together to have these conversations about solidarity. And instead of trying to ask that question, they took the applications of their company, went to those groups and said, how is this application, how is this setting, how is this piece of paper doing it wrong? What is turning you off from joining us? Not what can we do to do What can we do to do better to include you? What are we doing wrong to exclude you?
All right, then I'll follow up. What are we doing wrong to exclude you?
That's a real nice
So
long
I'm gonna
conversation.
actually try to answer this question.
Because we really are trying to grow our community in all different directions.
It's cool. All right, so I'm going to answer this question. So I think that one of the things at play here is that there are really two dimensions on which work happens. One is I'm a person, I'm running this game, I'm running this community, I'm running this company, whatever, right? And I want to do that work better with a diversity mindset. And the other is I am a citizen in the world and coexisting with all of these diverse citizens in the world. And how can I be sensitive of what I am doing to the fabric of, how my actions affect the fabric of society in the world. And one of the things that I think privilege, so you can really look at the question that you're asking from either of these lenses. How do I improve my game? And how do I make the world a better place? Right? And I think one of the things that privilege does is that it gives the privileged people the option to pick which lens they're working in. And most of the time, because most of the time we as humans are heads down, the person in the position of privilege is going to be looking at my work, my work, my work. And one of the things that happens when you're othered is that you are always called in to be forced to participate in the high-level question of who is in this conversation, who do I involve in this conversation, how do I behave in the sense of the larger society. So I think that part of the conflict that came with this question, sorry, this is going to get a little long, is that there's a different answer on these two dimensions, right? If you talk about on the scope of my work, how do I make this game more inclusive, we can do things like, invite more players, like, do some research before you, before you add, diverse characters, all this sort of stuff, right? But then I think the pushback answer is actually operate on the how do I make society better, and the most common and most effective answer I've heard for that is pass on the mic. Like, be demure, be the sort of demure, I'm not the protagonist, like I'm not the main voice in the situation, thing that minority people have to learn to do in order to be constantly producing and curating the larger story of the world from a support position and act from the support position. So now in practice, like sometimes you just have to build a game, you're building a game, you can't just always hand the camera to someone else, eventually you want to build a better game as well, right? So I think this long thing, my real answer is be sensitive of which frame you are operating from, the high level or the low level, and get the consent of the person that you're talking to. If you want to engage them in the immediate work frame, don't assume, because they're going to have to do the labor in the societal frame regardless.
Look, what I'm hearing now is not what is specific for the lab community. I think it's everything you have been talking so long is about the society on the whole. Could you maybe please give us some examples of particular situations in the labs where you felt excluded or something like that? Because I really don't understand what the problem is.
I have a really great example. Yeah. So a while ago, and I'm not going to name the person who made it or like the name or whatever. On a dare, a friend of mine was like, so there's this game, and it is it's set in China, and we don't know who we don't really know who the person who made it. We don't know what their ethnicity is. But we bet that it's going to be all white people, and you should go check it out. So I was like, okay, I will. And there's also free Chinese food, so why not? So I ended up going, and it was one of those scenarios where I was the only Asian person there, and everyone had to make their character name based off of a Chinese takeout menu. And that got really awkward. That's one example. Does anyone else have another?
Not that.
So I had an incident at a chapter of a national style campaign game of a high fantasy like that we may have all heard of at some point. And I want to talk about this in terms of the very, very minutia of what can disturb, offend, and choose the words and choices that you make that will create a sense of exclusion or offense within these spaces. Because racism and sexism and other isms are not necessarily about the obvious, direct, hard power moves and violence that pervades these systems. So one moment, and I was having, I'm going to say, this was a perfect storm of bad things happening, right? I'm feeling low energy. I was having problems dealing with things in the news regarding indigenous peoples, the killings and suicides news that I was reading about, and things that were just generally making me feel crappy about being me. And then I go to the game going, oh, I cannot be me. Put on my fancy little face paints and put in my garb and get my little packets and get ready to throw things at things. And before game on started, I'm walking around doing setup, talking with all of my friends in this big community, and then somebody I hear off, not even off in the distance, somebody, a close friend in fact, says, hey, I need to call a powwow real quick. Now, there's a lot of words that get used within the English language because the English language has a history of picking and choosing all sorts of terms depending on the area of the world that you sit in. It's a language of cultural assimilation. It is a language that beats other languages up and takes grammar out just for fun. So when we come across a move like that, specifically here where somebody says, I want to call a powwow, who hasn't heard somebody say something like that? Whether or not it's regarding your own culture or actually heard the word, I want to call a powwow about something. And so, but in that moment, I was particularly low energy. And I looked over at the person who was my friend and I said, fucking really? Really loudly. Really loudly. Now, a person of power who was playing at the game, who was a member of the larger over-national structure, turns to me and says, hey, tone it down. Right? Yeah. And says to me specifically that you don't need to raise your voice over this issue. And I looked at them and went, huh? Really? And I just got upset. So me allowing myself the space to be upset, went to other allies, had a good set of conversations, went to plot teams, went to the actual runners of the plot and the chapter, not the overarching national people, and had conversations about local politics, local spaces, and ways to create a conversation of inclusion. Later on, I had a player-marshaled conversation with that person. That's a national level staff member who was creating a powered interaction when they couldn't understand why that was a problem, why I was making a stink of it, and how to handle it better. I use the words, by using the word powwow like that in front of me, they were creating not a safe space for me. And their response was, your reaction to them was making it not a safe space for this person. And I went, okay, I'm gonna stop. You obviously don't get it. And I didn't take it further than that because they couldn't understand the depth at which they were doing this reverse racism in response to. And these are really, really nuanced spaces. So when you say, I want to create a more diverse environment, this comes down to, for me, a really, really strong look of reflection at your own linguistic actions and how you choose to design your settings, your paperwork, all of that, all has an impact.
I just wanted to jump in quickly. One of the things that we talked about before this roundtable was about the ways in which sometimes we have stories of being othered that are very stark and obvious, and other times the challenging dynamics are exceedingly subtle or might not be sort of hitting the obvious signifiers. So I think it's important to remember that not all of the behaviors that make people feel othered or marginalized have to be sort of these overt, but can be much more subtle, like the example.
Yeah, people who tell me to tone it down drive me completely crazy. Really irrationally, like to a degree. Because like, I think it's like, you know, I can be moderately irked by the first thing, but the second thing is just like, I don't know, it's like kind of, if you want to have a conversation about inclusion or something, right? Like, or if you want to, like, I understand that people who do this are doing it to try to create a supportive and warm and nurturing environment, but I actually really hate supportive, warm, and nurturing environments because I think that the fact is there is conflict, and if you don't let us surface the conflict, then that just means we eat the conflict, right? So like, y'all go deal with the conflict too.
So, with your example, like, I've never thought of powwow as a problematic word. I never had that perspective given to me, and that's a big thing that I see in different, whether campaign games or just large cultures, is no access to a marginalized narrative to figure out what is going wrong. Or people who are, you know, like very singular perspectives, creating content and mechanics of win conditions that suit a larger cultural context that favors them. And they then recreate that same, like, very minimal empowerment. So the question is, like, I want to hear more about, like, barriers to access and what is keeping those voices from informing game content and game and community codes of conduct.
You guys mind if I go again? I think there's a latent assumption here that the norm is that the information is available. And actually, like, in my experience at least, that's not the case. Like, when you're learning to survive in a different culture, you learn by trial and error, and if you break a rule, then somebody comes down on you. And so we just kind of grow up accepting a certain amount of friction in the social education process. So I actually think that's okay. Like, if you, like, I never thought about the word powwow either, honestly. But if I did that and somebody screamed at me, I would be like, oh, let me go think about that now, right? And it's okay to get screamed at once, right?
Anybody else?
I feel like I'm monopolizing microphone.
Yeah, me too.
I don't want
back
to.
here.
Right.
Well, I actually want to respond to Diane's valid critique of the way in which white people have to come to, you know, all their people of color friends in order to validate their large design decisions. And I think there is a difference, maybe in my mind at least, but there's a difference in asking someone to be an expert for their entire quote-unquote race and saying, you're a player of LARPs. I make this decision, how would that make you feel? And actually situating them as an individual subject, human being encountering your game. I think it's a very practical thing. So asking them not as like, what do brown people think of this thing? But rather, you know, you have a unique identity, what do you think? And ask multiple people of those unique identities. Because literally there's going to be a bunch of different perspectives. You're going to make some mistakes, as Jay says, but you have to make the outreach effort, or else you're going to stumble in maybe catastrophic ways.
Actually, I understand where you're coming from, Diana, with people coming to you to ask you about everything. I have a friend who's making a LARP right now, and he's been coming to me constantly. I'm like, listen, buddy, I'm happy that you're like making this LARP, but you know, he's like, oh, you know, I want to put these cultures and like different ideas. I'm like, no, don't do it. Like, it's just like, it's like, you know, you really just need to respect boundaries. And he's like, he really wants to at the same time, but at the same time, he wants to make everything diverse as well. Like have different like factions and stuff. So he's getting to that point, and he's like coming to me like, I'm still learning as well. Let's find out together and give us, you know, I want to help you, but at the same time, like I can't be your only source.
Well, to bounce it back, that's invisible labor that you would be doing for that person with
Exactly.
no real credit potentially.
Yeah.
Which speaks to that.
Yeah, jump again.
So a couple things. I think it's difficult because on one hand, talk to people and we need to consult. And I think that that's a really great suggestion, but then on the other end, it's this exhaustion level of constantly being consulted. So and then as an organizer for me, do I be transparent when I say, yes, we are looking for people of diversity, of diverse backgrounds? Because when I'm saying that, what I mean is, we want to create a space where you feel that you are absolutely welcome and your voice and your perspective is absolutely welcome. And that's one of the reasons nobody had actually pitched this panel. I think Gabriel mentioned it in his comments that I wanted it to happen because I really wanted to create that. And yes, it's because you are diverse, but it's not because of tokenism, if that makes sense. It's more because I think it's so important to have these conversations, especially for us who don't come from that positionality. And I wanted to respond to what Jay was saying. I do think it's absolutely valid to be angry, absolutely. But as someone who is an abuse survivor, I have to be really careful around angry people. And so you have to also think about who you're triggering on the other end and to what degree that shuts down communication completely. And so, it's not so much about bottling it, but more about learning ways to communicate that can facilitate growth and make the community better without having those like knee-jerk, well, this isn't a problem for me, so it's not a problem for you, or how dare you raise your voice at me, or and that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I don't necessarily have good answers for.
Okay, in the front row, did you have a?
I did. It sort of speaks a little to that. Going back a little, I don't want to overdo the topic. I heard, I don't want people to tell me to tone my voice down, like if I'm angry about something. Without this getting into like a broad discussion of just conflict resolution in general, thoughts on how can we make a space where people can be upset or offended or angry at something and be verbal about that and not feel like they have to present it in like oh, hey, I just wanted to tell you that like what you said really made me upset, like in like the most quiet, passive way possible. And yet, as Sarah was saying, not create a space where someone else is potentially being harmed. And I think democratization is okay. Like everyone can be a tiny bit uncomfortable rather than one person being super uncomfortable. I think that's a better thing. But I'm just wondering like techniques, approaches, and specific to this sort of thing.
I think maybe having like this middle person to talk to would be helpful instead of just. So yeah, you run the risk of like getting everyone triggered and like pissed off and whatever, but at the same time, having just go talk to your GM, go talk to like whoever who's like volunteering their time to listen to everyone. That might help. I mean, it's not the only solution.
For one of the games I play, it's a campaign game here in Austin. We actually have a player council, which is elected by the players to be representing the players. So if the people feel too uncomfortable to go to the GMs or anyone else on staff, they actually go to the players. And after each game, they actually have player council get-togethers on Skype that everybody can watch and talk, and listen, and send in questions to really see what the GMs and the player council discusses. So it really does have that middle person and then also there's a visibility between the player council actually bringing these issues up to the game masters themselves. So there is a lot of transparency between the players and the game masters about what is going on.
To the tune of that, I was actually very grateful to in that instance, that interaction, to actually have talked with a player representative. With that was somebody who was appointed to do those moderations of those interactions. But also, at the very same time, that national level staff member that I had that argument with was also a player rep for the organization within the chapter. So at the very same time that those offenses can get called out, if you are a game designer, appoint multiple people who are supposed to do this kind of work.
I think part of it is like this is a space in which each given set of people need a unique manual solution, right? The more intersectional you get, the more manual it is. And while there are some rules of thumb, they're not really rules of thumb. Like, for me, I actually, talking about othering, I identify as non-neurotypical as being a source of othering far more than I identify as being Asian as a source. So, like, from being someone who has a cognitive disability, I'm used to considering it my responsibility if I need to communicate to someone that there's a specific way that I need to be interacted with. And I think that for people who do experience sensitivities in interaction or in any of these, like, to be able to, like, I really believe that you should be willing to frame it as a disability and say, like, I want to engage with you in order to make a mutual safe space. This is what I need. I know that you have a problem with this historically and that, like, you know, you get asked to do this and it's not fair. But I'm asking you this because I need it personally, because there's something unique about me. Essentially now I'm othering myself when I make that request, rather than assuming that I should get it from someone because they should be polite to me. Because I think we really do just want to engage with people. Like, we're not here to not engage with people.
I think about organizers in particular in this role, and that organizers need to think about public skills. And one of the public skills that is most necessary, which is kind of one of the hardest things to do, is not have power over the discussion. So it doesn't matter what other we're talking about. I think it applies to all of them, whatever ism you want to talk about. But when your public is expressing a need, that you put yourself aside and you are able to do the hardest thing, which is, we always value talking, like in our culture, I think, more than listening, and that whole listening thing. So really developing organizers to develop the skill of listening non-defensively and knowing what to do with that information in an objective way is something I think all arts can benefit more from. I certainly don't have that mastered up. I always struggle with that myself. But it's something that becomes very true.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to give a quick comment and then move into a sort of final wrap-up question. But I think one of the things that has come out of a lot of what we've been talking about is being cognizant of power relations. And that in the example that you gave, there was a clear power differential. And so by telling you to be quiet, that was an imposition of power. And so if you are not only an organizer who clearly has power, but also that if you are someone who is from one of these unmarked and privileged groups, to recognize that power that you have in these situations. That when you are telling marginalized folks to be quiet, it carries a lot more weight. And I think that gets to this idea of the, like, reverse racism.
To speak onto that, like, real quickly, was that there is levels of lateral violence and nuance that get carried across. Violence isn't just hierarchical. It goes across and between groups. And what surprised me the most about this interaction was not only because of the powered interaction that occurred, but this was also a person whose life is in queer spaces as well. They were a queer person, and for them to make a move on oppression on me at that point, I was like, yeah, what?
All right, so our final question is to talk a little bit about sort of where you currently are on your journey towards inclusiveness and intersectionality. So are there particular projects that you're working on? Are there particular experiences that you'd like to share that you feel like point towards your future goals or things that you're really excited about that sort of tie into this theme of recognizing intersectionality and inclusiveness?
So, again, speaking as an Indigenous scholar, and a game creator and art designer, all these other fancy titles that we want to throw on it, I am presented on, in fact, at the EduLARP conference on a STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics LARP that was part of a program focused on and only including Indigenous people and Indigenous children specifically. And for me, the notion of building towards inclusivity is not a part of the work that I'm doing. The part of work that I'm doing is trying to create a center for my people, for the other Indigenous tribes, for other Aboriginal people, to actually have spaces for our cultural practices to be a part of play. So inclusivity isn't a part of my language in that space, but the methodology and the results and the things and the thinking that show diversity of culture and biodiversity of language and everything else that we're doing will come to be presented to non-Indigenous people as well as Indigenous folks. But I don't work necessarily from inclusivity first.
Okay. I'm still thinking.
Morgan, why don't you talk about your new elementary school here?
Oh yeah, I can do that. I'm going to do a Monticello in the second weekend in June, or the second run in June. And I'm playing a professor of cryptozoology who is a professor, well, it's written as Castle Law, but I decided that since I am Hispanic, I do want to bring in, because Peyton Morris did ask for people to, if people that are going to play, to be more positions of power, because they do want to show more diversity and show more culture and, just more liveliness to a game itself, which I am more than happy to help out since I'm going to the game anyways. So I decided to become a professor for doing cryptozoology, and instead of the Castle Law, I'm doing Castiello to really show my my Hispanic side of the family, which I'm super duper excited for. And so yeah, that's what I'm doing so far. I'm also hoping to keep on learning about everything since I'm still young and new, and learning about all the psychological sides to and the sociological sides to learning itself, and hopefully look into like the deeper issues of like why race is necessary in LARP and like in LARP games and stuff. And if there's a way we can improve that, and because I honestly don't think races are any sort of other verbiage that people tend to use to replace race, because we're like, oh, this isn't race, this is a clan, this is strains, I mean, I understand they want diversity in their game, but at the same time, how diversity can you deal without like poking holes into people's cultures and really, trying to, make a cost image out of it. And, I really want to look into hopefully seeing if there's other ways we can write LARPs, honestly.
I am currently working on season 2 of Talk with Board Game Designer. For those of you who don't know it, it is a YouTube channel. It's a YouTube series where I invite white cis dudes who are game designers, and I just berate them the whole time.
What?
It's Game and a Curry.
Game and a Curry.
And the YouTube series is Talk with Board Game Designer.
I guess being a Chinese person living in California, I'm really sensitive to the fact that a lot of racial issues affect me way less than most other people in our society. So I think the kind of two things that are really on my docket is working to be more sensitive and inclusive, especially of Black and Brown people, and I was about to be like Americans or citizens, but like Indians, all people. And also creating stories that are both inclusive of all genders and all ways of sexuality. I don't like asexual, aromantic, and how do you run like a relationship plot that is what's called indifferent to whether you're aromantic. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. I do have like my one or two friends that I go to for most of my questions. Fortunately, one of them is an activist, so she wants me to go to her. But I guess one of my, this is kind of back to the last topic, but like one of my takeaways from this is like if you hear that some people have a problem with some way of relating across the privilege boundary, but you genuinely want to go and do something, like to ask for informed consent, right? Like, they put the power in their hands. It's not like just because I might be frustrated that I get consulted a lot that I will never want to consult. It's just that I don't want the assumption there, not that I don't want the consulting there.
How much time do you have?
1 minute.
I was gonna say, any queer LARPers on Facebook, we also have a place for you. So if you identify as queer or not cis or whatever, that we actually have a secret group for you as well. So we didn't mention queerness much, but there are spaces for you.
Can allies join?
What's up?
Can allies join?
No, it is not a group for allies.
Then why are you saying me?
I'm saying there might be people who aren't totally out in this crowd.
Okay, sorry.
You know, so.
Yeah, the Lovers of Color listserv's really great. At least creeping on there.
I think I posted entirely too much in that.
I probably post a lot too. I don't want, but honestly, I really love the Lovers of Color group itself because it lets me, connect to people that I don't get to connect to on a daily basis. Because when I go to my own LARPs, for example, I used to go to a LARP that had about 200 people on average. There was like on two hands, all the LARPers of Color in a 200-person game. And it just, you just sit there and you'd be like, okay, that's cool.
Is that group open to allies to join and read?
It is. The LARPers of Color group is open to allies, and allies don't have to shut up, but they can ask questions. But then we are also not responsible to answer those questions. Research is also a welcome thing.
And sometimes it's good for other allies to answer the questions, so that LARPers of Color don't always have to be the ones who.
Are there groups for just allies?
Hmm?
Are there groups for just allies?
Oh, that's a really great question. So who wants to lead that? I have one last closing thought. I just kind of, because of something that happened earlier today already. Again, this is great that there are so many people here who want to talk, and that this panel exists, and that this conversation is here. And it is the beginning of the work. It is not the work. This is the beginning of a conversation. You need to have these conversations in your own communities, in your own groups, and it is group specific. Like, you have to be group specific about some of these engagements because there's no universalization to any of this. A lot of this is the manual work. There's no real magic bullet to any of the work that we're trying to do. And it's pervasive. And the notion that some people hadn't thought of the word powwow as a particular thing, well, I had a very violent reaction to one of the keynote speeches today. Guess which one? So I don't find a problem with the words that we're using on an everyday basis to be, that we're not dismantling them enough. That the reflection of your own language is embedded into the practices and the ways that you treat non-normative people, whatever that happens to mean. So if you're trying to say, I want to build more inclusivity in this, how about being invitational? Use the language of invitation. Use the language of cooperation. Use the languages of inclusion are very, very specific in how you can generate them. No, I can't answer those questions right now and here. If only we had the sum of human knowledge at our fingertips. Oh wait, there's Google. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not the end of it, and it's really, really, really deep. So it's not, I don't feel like any of this is going to be solved within my lifetime or even in my kid's lifetime. But we start now, because if we don't, it's just going to sit there.
Any final thoughts for our panel? I'm going to hold questions. If you've got questions, we are free to chat outside the panel. I just want to say, it's great that everybody's here, but I think one of the things that has been echoed also through this roundtable is don't expect people of color, don't expect people who are marginalized to do all of this work. This is work that needs to be done by allies as well. Educate yourself, talk to people that do hey, is this racist? Right? So